Thank you, Mr. President. And I ask unanimous consent to address the body. Mr. President, a little while ago, Senator Grassley of Iowa was down on the floor critiquing Senator Obama's tax plan in some detail. And right now, I am not prepared to refute what Senator Grassley said, although I strongly disagree with his conclusions. But I did want to talk a little bit about some of the differences that I perceive between Senator McCain and the proposals that he is bringing forth in terms of what Senator Obama has been talking about. I also, most importantly, wanted to make the point, and I think Senator McCain would be upfront in admitting it, that if he is elected president, what we are going to be seeing is 4 more years of the policies that we have seen in this country for the last 8 years, which have been a disaster for the middle class and working families of this country. And I wanted to spend a few moments on that. Mr. President, since President Bush has been in office, nearly 6 million middle-class Americans have slipped out of the middle class and are now in poverty. And I can tell you, Mr. President, that all over this country, in my state of Vermont, but all over this country, people who used to believe that they were securely in the middle class, people who looked to the future with optimism, are now lining up in emergency food shelves because the wages that they are earning are simply not enough to sustain their families. And we're seeing a run on emergency food shelves all over America from working families. And I can tell you that in Vermont and throughout the northern tier of this country, people are frightened to death about the coming winter because in many instances they simply don't have the money to pay the fuel bills which will keep their homes warm this winter. Mr. President, since George W. Bush has been in office, median household income has declined by over $2,100 for working-age Americans. That is a huge drop. Since Bush has been in office, over 4 million Americans have lost their pensions. People who have worked their entire lives at a company with the expectation that when they retired, there would be a defined pension plan available to them. That has not happened in 4 million instances. Mr. President, since George W. Bush has been president, 7 million Americans have lost their health insurance, and the cost of health care has soared, and more people are underinsured. Since President Bush has been in office, more than 3 million manufacturing jobs have been lost as corporate America has thrown people out on the street, moved to China, moved to Vietnam, moved to any country where they can pay people a few pennies an hour. Since President George W. Bush has been in office, nearly 500,000 jobs have been lost over the last 6 months alone, and unemployment today is over 6%. And I ask you, Mr. President, do we really need to continue these economic policies which have been such a disaster for the middle class and working families in our country? Do we need 4 more years of these disastrous economic policies? Mr. President, since George W. Bush has been president, total consumer debt has more than doubled. Everybody knows that. Everybody we know almost is in debt. We have a personal savings rate in this country today which is 0. Since President Bush has been in office, home foreclosures are the highest on record. Huge numbers of foreclosures all over this country. And in 2007, the typical American family paid over $1,700 more on their mortgage payments. Is that a record Is that a series of policies that this country wants to continue going for another 4 years? I think not. Not for ordinary people. If you're a millionaire and a billionaire, I could understand that, but certainly not for the average American family. Mr. President, since George W. Bush has been president, Americans are now paying $2,100 more for gasoline, $200 more for food, $1,500 more on child care expenses, $1,000 more for a college education, $350 more for health insurance, $600 more for after-school costs, and so forth. Bottom line is that the Bush economic policies have been a disaster for the middle class and for working families, and the only people who have benefited from these policies are the people on the top. And I don't believe that we need a president in Mr. McCain who is going to emulate these economic policies to the detriment of tens of millions of working families. Mr. President, when Bill Clinton was in office, and I have to tell you, as an independent, I had strong disagreements with President Clinton on a number of issues, including his trade policies. But when Clinton was in office, 22.7 million new jobs were created over that 8-year period. That is a strong record of job creation. Since President Bush has been in office, we have created fewer than 6 million new jobs. 22.7, fewer than 6. That is a real difference. Under President Clinton, 6 million Americans were lifted out of poverty. That is pretty good. Under President George W. Bush, over the same period of time, 6 million Americans have slipped out of the middle class and into poverty. Under Clinton, 6 million people rise above poverty. Under Bush, 6 million more Americans slip into poverty. Mr. President, are those the economic policies that we want to continue for another 4 years? Now, we have a national debt right now, which is an incredible disgrace. It is a debt that we are leaving to our kids and our grandchildren. And I always find it ironic, Mr. President, that our Republican friends pose as the party of fiscal responsibility. Oh, they're just staying up nights worrying about earmarks, just worrying about everything. Under President George W. Bush, the national debt has increased by $3 trillion. We're closing in on $10 trillion. Under President Clinton, we had record-breaking surpluses as far as the eye can see. I think there is a real difference between the economic policies we have seen under Bush over the last 8 years and the economic policies we have seen under Clinton the previous 8 years. And the difference is that under Clinton, the middle class grew and expanded, poverty went down. Under Bush, the middle class shrunk, poverty went up. But I have to be honest, Mr. President. Under President Bush, there have been people who have done very, very well. And while 90% of the American people have seen their incomes go down in the last 8 years, we do have to acknowledge that the people on top are not only doing well, they are doing fantastically well. And as an economic strata among the top 1%, those folks are doing better than at any time since the 1920s. In fact, the wealthiest 15,000 American families received a 57% increase in income under Bush. And we now have, and we don't talk about it too much, the absurd situation, Mr. President, that the top 0.1% earn more income than the bottom 50%. Now, I know a lot of folks get up here and they talk about family values and they talk about morality. Let me go on record as saying I believe that it is immoral that the top 0.1% earn more income than the bottom 50%. Mr. President, while the middle class shrinks and poverty increases, the average income of the top 400 American tax filers, and that represents 3 out of every 1 million taxpayers in this country, has more than doubled under George W. Bush, going from a mere 104 million in 2002. Now, how do you get by at a mere 104 million? They were scraping by, but the good news is that by 2004, that 104 million went up to 214 million a year. Adding insult to injury, the effective tax rate of the richest 400 people whose incomes are exploding has nearly dropped in half, from 30% in 1995 to only 18% in 2005, because of Bush's tax cuts for the rich. Mr. President, it is not just income, it is just wealth. It is wealth also. The wealth of that's the accumulated income of the richest 400 Americans has also soared under President Bush, going from a mere, now we're talking about 400 families. 400 families had a combination, had an aggregate wealth of $290 billion in 2000. They had when Bush came in, their wealth was $290 billion. It went to $1.5 trillion by the year 2006. $1.5 trillion for 400 Americans. And in our country today, we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any country on earth. We have 46 million Americans without any health insurance. And, Mr. President, I raise these issues to talk about what is going on in our society today economically, to point out that the policies of George W. Bush have very clearly worked if you're a millionaire or a billionaire. They have been a disaster for you if you're in the middle class or a working person. And I will commend Senator McCain for being pretty honest and straightforward and saying he wants to continue those policies. More tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires, more tax breaks for the largest corporations in our country, more efforts to privatize Social Security, more efforts to cut back on programs desperately needed by working families and low-income people. So, Mr. President, the thrust of what I just wanted to say this evening, and I was compelled to come down here because I heard Senator Grassley speaking before. And Senator Grassley, as I indicated earlier, was very critical of Obama's tax policies. And I disagree with Senator Grassley's conclusion. But I think if you're going to talk about Obama's tax policies, it is important to talk about McCain's overall economic policies, which are going to be 4 more years of Bush's policies. And this country, at least the middle class of this country, in my view, cannot survive 4 more years of those policies. So, Mr. President, that's about all that I did want to say this evening, and I thank you, and I yield the floor.